Yeah, interesting that you should mention all that, because one of the things I'm trying and failing to do this weekend, along with everything else, is when I got to where I'm staying in Boulder, there was a galley waiting of a book which will be published in October by Eric Davis called Technosis. And they want me to read it and do a blurb for it, which I'm happy to do. It's a little inconvenient to try and focus your mind in that way on the road. But he is making the case very eloquently that the new information technologies are in fact magical technologies and related to Hermes Trismegistus and the idea of action at a distance, which is a very central idea in magical theory. And he makes the point that I think I made here yesterday or Friday evening, I can't remember, which is that words which are power, words which make things happen, has been sort of off the burner in the West for a couple of centuries, and has now returned with the power of the codes that govern computational machinery, which he thinks of as communication machinery, that this is really what it's doing. One of the paradoxes, or one of the fascinating aspects of the 20th century and the rise of empiricism, positivism, rationalism, whatever you call all that, is that in a way it has fulfilled the magical agenda of the 15th and the 16th century. The agenda, which was transformation of the human form, immortality, a universal panacea, a universal medicine, this agenda enunciated by the magical thinkers of the late Middle Ages could never have been realized by their methods, or at least we think not. But by putting aside their methods and deconstructing matter, tearing into the cell, the genome, and so forth and so on, now we essentially can extend and prolong life, can, in a quasi-telepathic manner, communicate around the world, have created a world which I think would be the envy of people like Michael Centivorgius and Michael Meyer and all of the great late European alchemists. We have a kind of or most people I think have a kind of a misconceived notion of the history of occult thinking, in that people tend to believe that the further back in time you go, the more quote-unquote superstition you encounter. This is actually not true at all. The 12th century, the century when Christendom was at its great efflorescence, was an incredibly rational period, ruled over by scholastic philosophy, ruled over by Aristotle and Aquinas. It is the breakup of the medieval world and the injection of Islamic elements and the retranslation of, for example, the Hermetic texts and many other magical and Gnostic and heretical texts. That all happened in the Renaissance, in the 15th century, and it sets the stage for the 16th, which is the most demon-haunted, paranoid, hysterical century in the last 10 centuries in the West, with the possible exception of our own. And it's in the 16th century and the late 15th century that you get the witch burnings, the suppression of alchemical writing, and strangely enough, the great efflorescence of that writing. Because alchemy, alchemy has sort of is a spectrum, and on one end you have pretty nuts and bolts laboratory type procedures, working with materials, working with flame, and heating and grinding and calcinating all kinds of materials. But at the other end of the spectrum, you have what's called literary alchemy, which often rarely comes near the laboratory and produces instead alchemical poetry, for example. There's a wonderful, somewhat hard to obtain book called the Theatrium Chemicum Britannicum that is a compendium of English alchemical poetry produced in the late 15th, early 16th century. Beautiful and strange. And this is where the occult intent meets with like the art of memory and the, as you mentioned, the use of emblems to fix information. And the great stress in that late efflorescence of alchemy and occult thinking is the imagination, which again returns and illuminates all of our themes here. You know, the art of memory, as practiced in the late Renaissance, consisted of memorizing large architectural spaces, public piazzas and cathedrals and town plans and things like that, and putting this into your mind and then moving through it. I mean, I suppose in a Buddhist context we would call this a visualization, moving through this familiar territory. And for instance, if you wanted to give a speech about the 7 deadly sins, then at prominent places in this mental geography, you would, in your mind, place outlandish images. And the stress was on outlandish because the idea was they should be as memorable as possible. So, for instance, in the place of lust, to randomly choose one of the 7 deadly sins, you would image a woman in a nun's habit but lifting her skirts to reveal her genitals, or something shocking. The idea was to be shocked. And then when you stood before the Congress of Venice or whatever august body you were addressing, you would, in a sense, fall into a trance and make this journey through this mental building and meet your emblemata at these places where you had left them, and then they would trigger these associative strings of verbiage. And by this means, I mean, this sounds a little hokey, like would it work, could it work? Turns out something about the human mind, it works very, very well. And some of the oratorical feats, list recitation and stuff like this that's recorded, is astonishing. So this is an interesting confluence of magical intent, imaginative landscapes, and information and communication theory. At one time I experimented with this because my undergraduate days were spent at the University of California at Berkeley. And I used to, on the tail end of many an acid trip, I would go up to what I called the Big U, no pun intended, or pun intended, and wander around the Big U. And I got to know it so well, its nooks and crannies, its staircases and trapdoors and back entries, that it became for me like a memory palace. And I often find myself, when I'm in a public speaking situation, getting glimpses of recessional distances of hallways and staircases and to classrooms, and I realize, in my mind, all that lingered. I'm still part of the Big U. It is absolutely a virtual reality, for sure.
So by way, that what you're describing exactly what a good writer or poet does somehow.
Which part of it?
I got this information a few weeks ago, but I never knew about the medieval techniques to describe it.
Oh, I see.
So a really good poet or writer is doing exactly that, envisioning the picture so strongly in their mind that picture somehow gets hooked to the word, not just a good use of words. Beyond that, the picture comes through.
That's right.
The audience or the reader is getting the picture telepathically somehow.
Yes, they may not understand how the trick is done, but good writers and good artists can play these mechanical underpinnings of reality. For instance, I worked on a film project at one time, and it had 4 male characters in it, and the writer brought in Jung's archetypes of the collective unconscious, and he said, we'll make each guy an icon of one of the types of the unconscious. Well, this is magical and emblematic and archetypal thinking, where you pull energy to the surface and it all looks very mundane, but you're actually using the substructures of the human mind to imbue your characters with power in the reader's mind. Yeah, it's very interesting. Science believes that it's risen beyond magic and that's all part of our past. I think the future is for sure going to be very magical, and the practitioners of the magical arts these days are Madison Avenue, for example, where, the bottom line rests on how you can shove these images into people's minds and get them to stay there. And I don't know if you leaf through these pretentious high-end fashion magazines with the snarling ambisexual models and all that, you realize that the more jarringly it presents itself as a non sequitur, the longer you tend to linger over the ad, asking yourself the question, why would a French perfume associate itself with a pig in an automobile accident? And which is precisely what you're supposed to be asking yourself. I mean, if they gave you a woman in an evening dress with a floral overlay, this is not going to stick very long. So, and it's up to us as citizens of these quasi-magical societies to ever keep educating ourselves in front of those who would seek to control us. It's a push, it's a bootstrapping process. If you're interested in the history of Renaissance occult thinking, there's a wonderful world of scholarship and beautiful writing. I'm thinking especially of Dame Frances Yates, who wrote such books as The Art of Memory, Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, Magic and Mystery in the late plays of Shakespeare, so forth and so on. Because those are the people I relate to. That's the legacy I look back on. And I'll say something about this, actually, just because I will. A lot of times people send me email and they want to know, what do you think of Alesiter Crowley? What do you think of Madame Blavatsky? And I realize there's a great interest and hunger out there in the psychedelic demographic for this occult information. And what I always write back, and usually to the disappointment of my interlocutors, is that I think magic was pretty trivial after Eliphas Levi, after the mid-19th century or even before. And it's just a failure of people's education. If you're interested in great magicians, you should know that Alesiter Crowley is late derivative and not tapped into the main vein. It's no fault of his, it's just his position in historical time. But if you go back to Marcello Ficino and Trithemius, Bishop of Sponheim, Henry Cornelius Agrippa von Nettelsheim, Paracelsus, John Dee, Edward Kelly, Robert Flood. You see, the great watershed in European, in the development of the European mind in the past 500 years is the 30 Years' War, which in America, people don't even know, it's called in America the Protestant Reformation, which is a pretty gutless description of the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War begins in 1619 and goes until 1648. Yeah, I know it's not 30 years, but hey, they were rounding off. And at the beginning of the 30 Years' War, Europe is ruled by popes and kings, and the magical mentality is unchallenged. At the end of the 30 Years' War, Europe is ruled by parliaments and peoples, and the Royal Society has been established in England. Newton is beginning his early work. Descartes is articulating his thought, and we are at the brink of modernity. And this was the greatest tidal change in the West since Constantine embraced Christianity. So, and it would never have happened, I maintain, in quite the way that it did happen if psychedelics had been part of the menu of European experience. That transition to positivism and rationalism almost required isolation from the psychedelic experience, because the psychedelic experience raises too many questions that positivism would prefer not to deal with. It's the rise of psychedelic use in the West since 1950 that has brought all this back. In the 1950s, you could buy alchemical literature, 200-300-year-old books, almost by the truckload for nothing. I mean, it was wall filler. It was landfill material, because just people said, well, this is the raving of the late medieval mind, these superstitious, deluded souls. Now, of course, that's all incredibly expensive material, and many artists have mined those alchemical themes very successfully, because you can change the surface, the social surface, but you can't really change the archetypal architectonics of the human mind. And we gravitate to these spaces. We want transcendence, and the connecting thread through all of this, I think, is the imagination. And what science needs to become is more open to the magical possibilities, to the irrational, to the intuitional, the imaginal, ultimately.